It's fine, they're all coming. One minute or so.
Yeah. And will you stop sharing yours?
I will, yeah. Yeah.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We're just going to wait maybe one more minute to let people come in and settle in before we get started. Yeah, that's good. All right, hi everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are joining from in the world. I'm very excited to be chairing today's CDI seminar, in which we'll be launching and celebrating our special issue in the European Journal of Development Research on evaluating complex research for development programs, innovation to navigate complexity. My name is Mieke Snyder, and I'm a research fellow in the Participation, Inclusion and Social Change cluster here at IDS. And my research primarily focuses on investigating what happens when people are at the forefront of their own developments. And I do that primarily through evaluation research of participatory interventions. And I'm also interested in the use of theory-based participatory and realist evaluation approaches in complex evaluations, such as those in research for development. And I'm also a member of the Center for Development Impact. And the Center for Development Impact is a joint initiative between IDS, ITED, and the University of East Anglia. And we contribute to learning and innovation in the fields of impact evaluation through the use of appropriate mixed methods and robust evaluation designs. CDI's work helps to broaden the range of evaluation designs and methods, providing funders and evaluators alike with valuable insights and tools for evaluative thinking. And we do that through reflecting on methods to support evaluative thinking in complex development interventions, developing and delivering training and learning, for example, an upcoming participatory monitoring and evaluation short course that we're doing in May. And we're also supporting and implementing evaluations. And so the special issue that we are launching today is a collection of 8 papers that reflect on methods that support evaluative thinking in complex research for development. The special issue was edited by Marina Apgar, Grace Lynn Higdon, who are both online and will be presenting in today's webinar, myself, and Sylvia Sabo from the Department of Social Welfare Counseling at the Dongkok University in South Korea. For the special issue, we had 59 authors who contributed to the 8 papers, and the papers in the special issue present a mix of specific methods that are used in the evaluation of complex research for development, such as social network analysis, impact weaving, outcome trajectories, the first 2 which will be presented on today. Other papers also share approaches to evaluating different elements of complex research for development, such as evaluating equitable partnerships, looking at value for money, how to evaluate impact at early stages of R4D programs, and how research for development contributes to sustainable development goals, the latter which will be presented on today as well. And there is an interesting paper on how we develop theories of change for complex research for development, which will be shared today as well. And we think this is a great selection of papers, and we believe that this special issue can really help further evaluative thinking in the R4D field. So for the agenda for today's seminar, we'll first have Marina Apgar introducing the special issue. Then we'll have Karen Duffy presenting on theories of change in complex R4D programs. Arlene Gonzalez will share on her paper on evaluating research for development's contribution to sustainable development goals. Genoveva will present on impact weaving as an approach to strengthening the plausibility of anticipated agricultural research for development impacts. And then Evelyn Pauls will present on evaluating the relational dimensions of R4D through social network analysis. And then we have Prasanna Seligram sharing some reflections on the presentations today and the special issue and implications for the wider R4D fields. And we'll finish with a Q&A and a panel discussion. As you're listening to the presentation, feel free to add your questions to the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll get to them after all the presentations. So then now I will introduce Marina Apgar, who is a research fellow at IDS and a core member of the Center for Development Impact. She has over 20 years experience working at the intersection of evaluation, participatory interventions, and research. And she is particularly interested in combining theory-based and participatory approaches to exploring causal pathways and practicing inclusive forms of rigor. And she was also the lead guest editor of the special issue. So I'll hand over to Marina now to introduce the special issue. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Mika. Let me just share my screen. Hi, everybody. It's lovely to see so many of you on the call. Now, have you got the right screen? Let's see if we do this.
Yeah.
Are we seeing the right screen? Yeah, brilliant. Great. Well, thanks very much, Mika. Lovely to be here. And yeah, the journey of this special issue is rather long, as is often the case with these kinds of projects. And it's had a few sort of twists and turns along the way. And I always think that lots of really interesting things happen in the margins or at the intersections, probably very much my own bias of as an action researcher. And so what I offer as a diagram on the slide, this is in the introductory editorial that we wrote for the issue, is essentially the way we understand research for development. So what is it, this evaluand, right, that we're focusing on? So we describe it as sitting at the intersection of two worlds. And of course, each of those worlds comes with its own cultures and its own meanings. On the one hand, the world of development programming that cares about interventions that have impact on people's lives and address development challenges. And on the other hand, the world of research, which is about seeing knowledge co-production as a way in which we can address development challenges. Yeah. And my first experience actually of living in this intersection was while I was based at World Fish, so part of the CGIAR system. And so many of you, I'm sure, on the call will have some knowledge of the agricultural research for development field, which has its own long history and debate, and indeed much contestation about precisely how to navigate this hybrid reality and how to respond to the competing demands, and how to also engage with the different mental models that underpin these different worlds. But this special issue really came out of a more recent conversation with a group of us, many of whom are on the call and will be presenting today, who were part of evaluating large programs funded through the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is a UK aid investment into research as a way to support or address development challenges. And so this offered this amazing opportunity to experiment across many different challenge areas and many different disciplines. And you'll hear more from some of the other speakers. And so we came together as a MEL cohort, those of us who were involved in evaluating these programs. And this included academics, evaluation researchers, MEL practitioners, program managers, communications and impact and engagement officers. So quite a diverse group of people. And from our different unique positions, we were all facing similar evaluation challenges that responded to the funder requirements, which indeed shifted along the way of the GCRF journey. We were at times constrained by our own institutional environments and frameworks, and perhaps also by our own disciplinary and methodological biases. No? And we also lived through a series of crises. So we had to deal with navigating the pandemic in the way in which the programs were being implemented, but also what that meant for evaluation. And then we had the unexpected, quite large funding cuts that were a consequence of a shrinking of the UK aid budget. And for some colleagues in some of the programs, this meant that evaluation actually was no longer a priority or became quite difficult. So out of this space of diversity and adversity, it's perhaps not surprising, right, that it became a hotbed for thinking outside the box, right? And this is what I think most evaluators do when they're trying to make sense of long, unpredictable causal pathways or impact pathways, which is very much the reality of research for development. And so essentially what we were as a group was experimenting with what some might call complexity-aware evaluation. So the idea of actually putting these ideas together into a special issue emerged out of that context. And so as we were looking across the rich experiences, which you'll hear some about in a minute, as an editorial team, we could see that there were these 4 interrelated areas of tensions that are common actually to much of the work we do with complexity-aware evaluation. And so the papers essentially are presented around these 4 tension areas that illustrate, and the papers themselves are illustrating how these tensions can be reconciled and the methodological innovation that one requires to evaluate hybrid research for development programs. So I'll just introduce them very briefly. The first is not really a new tension at all, and everybody I'm sure will be very familiar with it. It's the classic old accountability versus learning tension. So on the one hand, we need to evaluate and understand performance, and on the other hand, we need to be learning as we go, yeah, particularly in the context of unpredictable impact pathways. And so there is there's a number of papers in the issue that speak to this, and we'll hear more about it in a minute, but I just wanted to mention one, which is a paper by Heidi Peterson, which is actually a process that happened within BAYS across a number of R4D programs, where they present an alternative to value for money, and that what they're basically arguing is that you have to first think about what you value in order to then design systems that can help you evaluate in ways that are fit for purpose. And so they offer this really interesting account of using rubrics to rethink value for money. The second tension is one that I spend a lot of time grappling with. And it's about how can we be theory-based and how can we build on the evidence that exists around how R4D works, while at the same time holding these theories lightly in order to have enough space to allow emergence and to be surprised by what might happen. And so there are 2 really fantastic methods presented in papers that speak exactly to this tension. So you'll hear about impact weaving from Jenna Weffer, but also Baru Darthwaite's work on outcome trajectory evaluation. Really nice examples of methodological bricolage that help us do this. The third tension is around the relational dimensions. And so central to large co-produced research programs or participatory research programs is the way in which we engage with each other, but also with partners, right? How do we navigate power? How do we build equitable relationships? So thinking about those internal dimensions is really important, particularly for adaptive management. But that can't be at the expense or at the cost of being able to then look beyond ourselves and understand what is actually being achieved and the material changes in people's lives. So you'll hear more about some of the ways in which this is discussed by some of the papers. But also just to draw attention to one of them, which is by Isabel Vogel and Chris Barnett, colleagues from ITAD, who are working on the ongoing GCRF evaluation, so the evaluation of the whole GCRF fund. And they share some early findings. And within that, they talk about building blocks of impact. So a really nice way to think about how we set up for impact further down the road and how we sequence evaluation over the lifetime of a project. And so the fourth tension relates to the issue of scale. As we see more and more investment and larger R4D programs, the question of how we look from the specific interventions and realities of people's lives to programs up to fund levels is, I think, a really interesting conundrum we're all grappling with. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that from one of the papers as well. So I just want to offer, I guess, these four tensions as a framework, a heuristic, a way to help us learn across this sort of emerging, evolving practice of evaluating research for development. Back to you, Mika.
Great, thank you so much, Marina. Yeah, so these four tensions have shaped the special issue and is also something that the other presenters will come back to and reflect on based on their work as well. So thank you, Marina. And I will now hand over to Karen Duffy. Karen Duffy is head of the section of organizational psychology at the University of Cape Town. She is a program evaluation teacher, supervisor, researcher, and consultant. Her evaluation research interests lie in the areas of training, evaluation, and program theory. She has worked collaboratively on several evaluation projects, investigating the design, implementation, and immediate short-term outcomes of development programs. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Mika. And hello, everybody. Truly hello from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you for this opportunity to present our paper on theories of change in complex research for development programs. As Mika said, I'm Karen Duffy. I'm one of the authors of the paper, but some of my co-authors are in the room and will be assisting in the facilitation of the discussion after the presentations. So I'm not going to go through the tensions, but as Marina just very clearly laid out, our paper kind of cuts across two tensions. Tension number one around accountability versus learning, and then tension number two around how do we deal with theories of change that can still capture emergence. So before we start, I think it's important just to give you a little bit of an overview of the context. So the GCRF comprised 12 interdisciplinary research hubs. And those hubs functioned as hybrid research for development programs. The hub's research was closely aligned to 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals that aim to address complex societal problems and policy change. The hubs were made up of approximately 400 unique organizations with 550 researchers in 85 countries. And each hub had thematic, geographical, and operational research streams that worked collaboratively in order to achieve certain objectives. So what is a theory of change then, or sometimes as we refer to it, a TOC? So theories of change typically are mandated by funders, and these are really visual depictions of how and why a program works. and they can be quite powerful and strategic to be used as MUL tools, monitoring, evaluation, and learning tools. But what we found through our research was that within the GCRX context, there were opportunities and challenges that came about when we were trying to unearth the underlying assumptions of the hubs. And this was predominantly because of the complexity that existed. So when we speak about sort of complexity features, we found that the hubs were complicated and complex. Complicated because the hubs comprised of multiple components that were operating concurrently or sequentially. And within these components, each of them had varied spheres of influence. And also complicated because of how the hubs were set up. They were coordinated partnerships with multiple actors. And so this was quite across the board, quite complicated. Complex, as Marina suggested, because with the research for development programs, these causal assumptions or the underlying logic of the programs aren't necessarily linear, and they need to account for emergence. And so for our research, we really wanted to delve into, these challenges and opportunities that existed in the process of the TOC. So what we set out to achieve was we wanted to document the how. How did the hubs, what process did the hubs go through in order to develop the TOC? And then what did it look like? What was the end product of that visual graphic? We also wanted to determine to what extent was the TOC used for MUL purposes and used for learning purposes. And then we also wanted to identify within the different hubs whether there were complexity-aware approaches or innovations that were present during this process. So our paper goes a lot into the various results from our interviews with different hubs, but I wanted to pull out the 4 challenges and tensions which really stood out for me in this process. And the first is around this consensus building takes and building of trust takes time. And so if you've been involved in developing TOCs, I hope that you will acknowledge that the process is as important as the end product. But in order to get people into a room and get them to have consensus on what the program is trying to achieve and how, you need to have difficult conversations, and you need to sometimes have different perspectives. And you also need to be open and honest to be able to share your own thoughts. And so all of this takes time. And within each of these hubs, it's one thing that they didn't have was time. And so this process did cause stress and anxiety. I think another key thing that stood out for me was within the hubs, there wasn't a dedicated MUL practitioner. So it seems that the MUL component was maybe downplayed at the proposal stage. And so the MUL portfolio was really added onto a researcher or a hub manager on top of their already busy roles and responsibilities. But MUL could be somebody's role, in its own right, their sole responsibility. And I think that if there would have been a dedicated MUL practitioner, perhaps we would have seen different results that came through. As always with working with humans, there was resistance. So I think one in that the TOC was being mandated by the funder, but also given the makeup of the hubs that I spoke about earlier and the diversity of the hubs with academics and researchers and scientists and practitioners, in some instances, there were cases of perhaps not an appreciation of MUL and perhaps a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of why would TOCs be necessary and important, and how could we use this as a learning tool going forward. And then lastly, the unrealistic expectations, which Marina spoke to now in her introduction, around that when you're trying to develop a theory of change, it's a delicate balance of trying to be simple enough so that anybody can understand, but at the same time trying to be detailed enough. And so in these cases of complex research for development programs, because they're so complicated and because they're so complex, you want people to think freely and to sort of map, but that creates a beast. And then, of course, the funders had very specific stylistic requirements for what the TOC looked like. And there was a little bit of tension that caused. In hindsight, I think that the funders acknowledged or realized that, you know, these programs are so huge, and perhaps by putting in a suggestion of a one-pager theory of change may have in some way tried to control a little bit of that chaos. But nevertheless, it was a tension that came through. So in this process of needing to develop theories of change for these complex programs, what were some of the solutions that we found in the hubs? So the first one, and what majority of the hubs did, was they consciously imposed linearity when developing and visually depicting their theories of change. And the reason for that was firstly because for clarity and also for ease of communication. The disadvantage of imposing linearity in those contexts is that often there were certain components that were omitted, and also feedback loops weren't included. We did see in one or two hubs they used what is called a nested theory of change, which essentially is that there was a static theory of change, an overarching static theory of change, and then for each component there were these nested TOCs, and those could be more detailed and those could be emergent as things progressed. But we did find that in some of those situations, the nested TOCs didn't work just because of resource constraints. And then we had one hub who did a really innovative systems mapping to present their TOC. So again, they also had this overall theory of change at the top, and then they had these visual impact pathways. And that really allowed them to do multiple iterations and to add in the details and to change as the system kept emerging. And so this was, although it was extremely resource intensive, I think they spent quite a bit and they had to get consultants in, it definitely was an innovative approach given the complexity that they faced within that hub. So what are the reflections of going through and speaking to the hubs about this process? So, and then trying to tie these back to the tension. So in terms of the tension between performance management and reporting requirements, and this idea that the hubs chose linear visualizations, you know, the literature proposes a whole host of different frameworks and different approaches that one can use to map complexity and to map emergence. And within these hubs, there were quite significant researchers, but it seemed that these frameworks were out of reach or maybe not accessible given the context. And so this is why the hubs opted for this linear approach. And so that sort of questions, you know, are the frameworks the problem? Is it around fit for purpose? Is it around context? What is it that we need to take into account there? And at the same time, I think while we are developing new ways of dealing with complexity, and this dialogue is constantly evolving around complexity, I also think that what we found from the research, and something that perhaps affirms, I've been a program theory person for many, many years, it affirms that in some contexts, maybe simple is better, and maybe linear does serve its purpose. And then the second key reflection is really around this idea of to what extent can theories of change be these strategic and important tools for learning. And what we found in the hubs that were interviewed was that the TOCs were used as a mechanism to kind of standardize language across the team, was really used as an opportunity to depict the broad, overarching and bigger picture goals. And it was used to help develop logical frameworks, but not necessarily as a learning tool. But given that the programs stopped because of funding cuts, we don't actually know what would have happened. You know, could it have been used for learning had time gone on? So those were my reflections. Thank you for allowing me to share, and I'm looking forward to engaging in the discussion afterwards.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. And if you're interested in more detail about the specific hubs and specific reflections, this paper is in a special issue, so I recommend reading it. Our next presentation is from Arlene Gonzalez, who is a PhD student at the Asian Institute of Technology in Bangkok, Thailand. She was hired as a research assistant for the Trade Hub project, which is one of the GCRF challenge hubs since 2020. And she was assigned to work for the MEL component on this hub. She has worked closely with the UNEP WCMC for the management of the monitoring and evaluation dashboards that led to the creation of the Trade Hub's Sustainable Development Goals brochure, and lately their paper on evaluating the contribution of complex international research for development programs to sustainable development, which is the paper she'll be presenting on today. And currently, Arlene is in the Philippines serving as associate professor and a researcher in the fields of environmental science, climate change, ecology, mangrove ecosystems, and sustainable development at the Mariano Marcos State University. So Arlene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone. And of course, I'd like to thank Karina and everyone who organized this seminar for choosing our paper to be one of the paper to be presented in this seminar. So the topic or the title of our paper is on the evaluating the contribution of complex international research for development programs to the Sustainable Development Goals, taking into consideration the case of the Trade Hub as a case study for this particular paper. So evaluation plays a crucial role in determining the outcomes and impacts of complex international development research projects. Evaluation can clarify whether the research is effective and what specific change it contributes to by building evidence of the benefits of policies, programs, and strategies. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals provide a new lens through which global needs and desires can be translated into solutions. Project evaluation is an important process to gauge progress of achievement and produce evidence of what is effective. Now, recently, the development activities are encouraged to devote attention to sustainability, along with the usefulness and effectiveness of their projects. However, the key challenge in doing SDG contribution evaluation is the approach or method that meets the evaluation requirement. Now, the objective of this paper is to provide a comprehensive review and mapping of SDG evaluation tools and methods applicable for international development research projects. So it aims to examine the applicability of the most frequently used evaluation methods to international research for development projects' contribution to SDG progress using the UKRI GCRF Trade Hub project as a case in assessing this applicability. So mapping of SDG contribution was based from the outcomes from every partner of the Trade Hub within the context of the 6 big wins, which are illustrated in here. And the outcomes were matched with the corresponding SDG targets with their connection and relationship map, supported by pairwise comparison analysis using the analytical hierarchy process as identified as the most frequently used tool in doing the SDG evaluation. Now, this simple method of SDG mapping was further extended with the interaction analysis among and between the project outputs to determine the synergy and trade-off in between the SDGs. So the type of interaction include canceling, counteracting, constraining, neutral, enabling, reinforcing, and indivisible. Now, our analysis showed that 6 big wins, or the 6 big wins of the Trade Hub, contributed to 10 of the sustainable development goals, encompassing the social goals, which includes SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 3, good health and well-being, SDG 10, reduced inequalities, SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. For the economic goals, it was mapped that The 6 big wins contributed again to SDG 1, 2, 8, 9, 10, and 17. And for the environment goals, it was mapped that the 6 big wins contributed to SDG 12, SDG 13, and SDG 15. Now, the mapping of the impacts of the activities undertaken by the partners in the Trade Hub, which was harvested from the reporting dashboard of the Trade Hub monitoring and evaluation learning dashboard, it showed that the most of the fulfilled SDGs were due to the big wins which are in SDG 12, SDG 15, and SDG 2. The big wins that are majorly contributing to these goals are the big wins number 1. So let me go back to the second slide. So big wins number 1, big wins number 5, and big wins number 2. So these are the big wins that has the greatest contribution to the SDGs. The weight indicate, and of course, how we were able to determine is, of course, with the tools that we used, we were able to derive values and we were able to identify the ranking of the big wins, and of course, and the weight as well of the SDGs, where the big wins have great impacts or contributions. So the weights indicated that the greatest contributions comes from farmers' incentives and empowerment, followed by the international trade agreements and regulations and nature and social impacts of trade. So it can be noted that the SDG 12 is directly associated to most of the big wins, followed by SDG 15 and SDG 2. For the interaction analysis, due to the limited time, we were able only to make an interaction analysis for SDGs 12, 15, and 2. So the interaction found in these SDGs were more on the synergies of the outcomes, either resulting to enabling, reinforcing, and indivisible to the SDGs. However, 2 trade-off interaction were listed. So those were represented by the orange arrow, which include the shift in commodity priority and production practices that may temporarily reduce the yield, potentially affecting the livelihoods of the farmers in the short run, which results to a counteracting relationship against livelihood and forest management. Now, based from our experience of doing arriving with this paper, so the following are our reflections. So the analysis and mapping made use of the information reported by our partners in the M&E dashboard of the project. So we highly recognized all the small and big contribution or impacts or outcomes that were reported by our partners. And the simple mapping approach was done to come up with this SDG mapping contributions of the Trade Hub. However, in order to defeat the simplicity of the analysis, we further extended the analysis into interaction analysis so as to arrive with a more complex and well-represented interaction and synergies and trade-offs at the end of the project. Now, the milestones reported for this SDG mapping are only the accomplishments of the project in its 3rd year of implementation. So more can actually be mapped and a greater impact could actually be reflected at the end of the project. And outputs need to be evaluated for SDG impacts to establish a comprehensive report on the contribution to sustainable development. So that's it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great, thank you very much, Aline. So we'll move on to Genevieve Blundercanto, who is a development economist based at the French Agricultural Research Center for International Development. Her research focuses on impact assessment of agricultural research for development interventions. In her PhD, she studied multiple links between ecosystem, surface provision, human well-being, and agricultural diversity. biodiversity, sorry. She pursues research in impact evaluation of AR4D, so agricultural research for development, focusing on mixed methods, systemic participatory approaches, and navigating complexity. Over to you, Genevieve.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen correctly because I only have one screen, but let's see. So thank you very much for inviting me to this to the special issue, first of all, and me and my co-authors, and to this session. So today I want to talk about this method that we have developed as an approach to strengthen the plausibility of how we anticipate agricultural research for development impact pathways. So really focusing on this, creating this anticipatory knowledge of the future that can guide how we work and navigate the present. And this is a method that we have developed in the past year and a half with my colleagues in Colombia from AgroSavia, which is the National Agricultural Research Institute in Colombia. And so we have applied this method on 6 pilot cases so far. And the paper in the special issue focuses on 2 specific pilot cases that we delved into in depth. So impact weaving. So we called it impact weaving because it really wants to give a sense of the long-term approach process that you have to develop with stakeholders when building more plausible, more grounded interventions. But this presentation and the publication specifically focus on a key part of this process, that the first, let's say 3 steps, of which one is really key, and it's the participatory workshops. So what were the objectives for this method, for developing it? It was really to identify, develop interventions that respond to the needs and expectations of the stakeholders within their context of action, and with taking into account their own future visions for their context of action. It's a method that embraces system thinking. We really focus on making explicit the role of diverse actors, perspectives, resources that are required to achieve change and within desirable future visions. And taking into account that innovation has multidimensional consequences, positive, negative, on different actors, and this can actually evolve. It's a dynamic process. So the method focuses on integrating past knowledge. So we use, let's say, a context analysis, building on past knowledge from researchers, other stakeholders, plus integrating the knowledge of the current context from the stakeholders, and also integrated this future knowledge, this anticipatory knowledge of how things would look in the future, might look in the future, potentially would look in the future. And its main tool, let's say, it's participatory scenario building, but it's actually just one step within a larger process, but it's really the key step of this process. So we use 3 tools. One is, it's multiple tools, sorry, from foresight analysis. So we use the future triangles, the 3 horizons that I will speak about quickly. We use quantitative adoption modeling participatorily in the participatory workshop within one version of the method. So we have 2 versions of the method. And we finally have developed an impact pathway and an action plan that develops this impact pathway and allow us to guide monitoring, evaluation, learning, and have this sort of steering tool for our future action. So in the method has 3 steps. I really hope you don't see all these things that I'm seeing on the screen, but sorry if that's the case. So we have a first step, which is based on work from the research team specifically that will develop or design the research intervention with multiple stakeholders. And it's focusing on a context analysis that is based on a tool, a matrix, let's say, that looks at what are called STEEP V elements, so social, technological, economic, environmental, political, and values elements of the context. And this is based on the knowledge of the researchers, their expertise, the key actors with which they have interacted in a specific territory. and the data that is available before going to the workshop. Then we have a full big step, which is, it's only 2 days, but it's a sort of rapid assessment, but it's an intensive 2 days where we build the analysis of this future pathway and the action plan that we can implement to achieve it. So we have different cases. One case, it's when we have a validated technology and innovation that is already ready, let's say, to be scaled out. It has been used in other contexts, and now it's ready to be used in a new context. In that case, we analyze how it would actually change the context and what changes in the context are needed for it to be actually used and useful. We analyze there's a second step, there's a second option, let's say, which is the predefined technology, where the technology has not been yet validated in real conditions, and that's what we, the first step to identify the attributes that are needed for it to be actually useful in a specific context. Then we start with the participants really revising, analyzing the context in depth, the actors that would be using the technology or not, would be adverse to it, the values that they bring, the social, economic, technological, environmental, political elements of the context that might affect the use of this technology. We then do the quantitative adoption modeling. So we identify the user's universe, a use bet of the technology, what would be the maximum users, the minimum users, the potential evolution of the use of this technology. And we identify first impact listing at this step. And then we go into the foresight tools. So first we use the future triangles, which allows to identify multiple scenarios. So in the workshop, we either develop one scenario or more, depending on the specific context, the specific objectives, and the way we are interacting with the stakeholders. And this future triangles looks at the present with what is pushing towards the use of the technology or towards other dynamics, what is the weight of the past and that might hinder the use of the technology, and what are the pulls of the future, what trends, what dynamics do we see at the horizon that might affect the context in which the technology would be developed and used. And then based on the interaction between these three triangles, we develop one or two visions of the future that are modified, futures that are modified by the use of this technology. Then we take this future vision, this future condition, this future state, and we develop a backcasting approach, which is called the three horizons. So we fill in the future elements in horizon 3, the present elements in horizon 1, and then we develop the transition pathway. This can be 10, 15, 20 years. Usually we work with 10 to 15 years, which is more manageable for identifying this pathway. And it's all the events that led from this future. So we have a backcasting approach to the present today, and it guides the action plan. And it takes a very systemic view of how the technology might be actually used within a certain context and within a certain uncertain future. Then we finalize the identification of the impacts and what are the heterogeneous impacts, positive, negative, and for whom of this future with the use of the technology. And then the researchers come back and together and fine-grain the users and impact estimations. They develop the intervention design based on all these results, ML plan, and so on. So this is really a focus on the participatory workshop, but the process is much larger. And there's a second version of the method, which is based on an exploration of a specific theme and context. So it's not based on a technology, and it uses foresight tools to finally develop an impact pathway. So what are the key learnings from this method in terms of how do we do this evaluation, this analysis of prospective theories of change while also capturing and exploring the emergent change? For us, this is really a journey that we do with the different stakeholders, and that does not stop, obviously, at participatory workshops, where we design a co-produced view of what is impact along uncertain pathways. That's why we have multiple potential scenarios, multiple combinations of the different triangles, as we have seen in the future triangle. But it's also manageable because it's a sort of rapid reality check and assessment of the transformations that are necessary for technological change or are triggered by technological change, or to achieve a common future vision when we are not focusing on a specific technology. It allows us to identify action plans that are more grounded, more plausible, and to prioritize and optimize the resources and partnerships that researchers need to develop to actually support the development, the achievement of this action plan. And it really fosters collaborative research planning and evaluative capacity, but also anticipatory capacity of different stakeholders, specifically for the researchers, but also for the other stakeholders that are involved in the process. But it also speaks to evaluating across scales, because it allows us to see how the use of an innovation will enable capacity, practice, interaction changes within future scenarios. But it also allows us to see what are the system transformations that are needed for this innovation to be used and actually contribute to these changes. And so it allows us to identify what are the short-term, the low-hanging fruits, let's say, within this action plan that research can contribute to, but also what are really the systemic transformation and roles of multiple actors to achieve it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Genevieve. It's a great example of methods that can be used in research for development. So now over to the last paper presentation by Evelyn Pools, who is the impact consultant of the UKRI GCRF Gender Justice and Security Hub, based at the London School of Economics Center for WPS, and a researcher at the Berghoff Foundation in Berlin. Her academic work explores the reintegration of female ex-combatants in Colombia and Uganda, as well as Burundi, Indonesia, Nepal, and the Philippines, through participatory documentary filmmaking. And her research interests include gender and conflict, participatory and visual methods, and research impact. Over to you, Evelyn.
Thanks, Mika, and thanks for having us and letting us present this paper. First of all, thank you to Marina, actually, who was a really driving force in this paper, and we really couldn't have done it without you. So if at any point you want to chime in and add anything to this presentation, you are more than welcome to. But I'll be speaking about the use of social network analysis in revealing the relational mechanisms of research for development. And this is a collaboration between 3 of the hubs that are part of the GCRF cohort. So my hub, which is the Gender Justice and Security Hub, the Tomorrow Cities Hub, and then also the One Health Poultry Hub. And we're a large group of people. I have them all here on the screen. So thank you to everyone who contributed to this paper. And we're kind of a mix of researchers, impact and evaluation specialists, and a few of us also with expertise on the technical aspects, of course, of social network analysis. Just to preface that I'm not one of them. So if you have technical questions, I would advise you to turn to the appendix of the paper, where you can find all the specifications and everything we used in greater detail than I'll be talking about today. But I'll tell you why we decided to write this paper, why we decided to use social network analysis to explore the networks that we're building in our hubs, what some of the key findings were, and then I'll reflect on some of the tensions that Marina outlined in the beginning. So basically, how did we get to using this method? We kind of started out from the realization that all of us are involved in building these giant, complex, complicated networks of researchers, practitioners, activists, scientists across the world, and that these networks are actually going to be a major outcome of the hubs of the 5 years of our work. And in many of our theories of change, building these networks was actually a crucial way to impact. And be that in advancing gender justice, which is my hub, or to ensure the safe and sustainable poultry production, or to improving disaster risk reduction in building tomorrow's city. So all of us kind of had this network building as a major stepping stone to achieving impact. And we were asking ourselves, how do we track the development of this network, right? How can we understand what we're actually doing over the course of the 5 years with all these people that we're connecting? And if we're creating the kind of network we want to create, which is equitable, decentralized, and highly connected. And so we ended up with a sort of 3-part question, which I think guided a lot of the work that we did on this topic, and then also how we wrote the paper. So I summarized them sort of in 3 areas. The first, the question of learning. How do the hub networks evolve over time, right? How are we building this network? Which networks are being developed? Which people are connecting? And social network analysis is like an excellent tool to do exactly that, to show how a network is looking like and then developing over time. And then the second part is around adaptation. And Marina spoke about this a bit in the beginning about adaptive management. Is that how can we ensure that we're weaving our networks in desirable directions? For example, by encouraging stronger South-South cooperation away from the centrality of UK partners. And I think the Tomorrow Cities Hub in our paper puts it in a really good way when they say that it's about identifying opportunities to enhance interdisciplinary and equitable partnerships as part of adaptive program management. So this is kind of the adaptation element of it. And then finally is, how does this network lead to impact? And that's maybe the most important question. And here we wanted to assess the contribution of network collaborations to achieving the intended impacts of our programs. And whether or not this was possible, we did this, I'll talk about in a second. And just to say that in our case of the Gender Justice and Security Hub, our main objectives were first to have kind of a visual map of the hub network, just to be able to communicate what we're actually building and how that looks like, and to document how these network connections would change over time, both in number and in strength. And then to also identify the patterns of connections within the network. And I think this was something that was shared across all the hubs. So we were all interested in how geographies, gender, fields, career stages, etc., might affect how well you are connecting with others as a member of the hub. And then finally, of course, build an enabling environment for collaboration. I spoke about that already. And we also heard a bit about, in the introduction already, about the importance of relationships and relationships between partners as a central mechanism for shaping activities, as well as engagement and impact strategies. And this was really the foundation that we started from. And it's the basis on which any impact happens, sort of both among the members of the hub, and then as a second step, of course, also beyond the members of the network. Right, so some of the key findings that we had, and I'm not going to talk through the technical parts, as I said, but what's important to note before I go into this is that all of our findings are from the very early stages of setting up the hubs of the first 1 to 2 years. The Poultry Hub has an extra data point from during the pandemic, and I'll talk about that in a second because it's really interesting. But overall, it's worth knowing that we all had sort of the ambition to repeat this over several cycles, and we were all a little bit limited in doing that due to the funding cuts, which we talked about. And for example, in our case, that meant that we couldn't do more rounds of this to the same extent. So we actually don't have this progression beyond the first 2 time periods where we did the survey. There are a couple of findings that are similar across all the 3 hubs, and I've drawn out some of them. The first one is that originally at the setting up stages of the hub, networks were created that were quite centralized around a key group of largely UK-based people who are high-degree actors. And that means that they have a lot of connections among themselves and also among other members. And I've brought one graphic, several more in the paper, which you should have a look at, but just to show you a bit what this means. This is from our hub, so the Gender Justice and Security Hub, and the colors are by are per country. And I just want to draw your attention here to the central part of the network, which means that these are the I mean, the size of the bubbles also correspond to how well people are networked. And you can see here that really the red part, which is the UK, is really at the center of the hubs here. And this kind of matched our expectations, because the way that the GCRF hubs were set up, of course, the original funding was awarded to UK universities, and that was sort of the starting block for how these international networks were then created. So it makes a lot of sense that at the beginning, at the initiation phase, it would be a centralized network around the UK. We can see that at the beginning stages, there was a lower level of South-South collaboration compared to North-North and North-South collaboration. And you can see here, for example, if you look at the orange parts, which are our colleagues in Sri Lanka, you can see that they're quite far apart from each other in the network. They're all connected to the center, but they're not clustered and well connected, first to each other and then also to other Global South-based members. Another interesting factor, which we didn't find in the gender hub because we're largely women, but the other two hubs found in their analysis, is that men were generally more connected among themselves. People who identified as men in the survey were more connected among themselves than women were among themselves. And I think that's an interesting dynamic to think about. I'll speak about it in a little bit more detail later. And especially among the in the Tomorrow Cities Hub, they found that this effect was more pronounced, or they found this effect in the UK. So in the teams that were not based in the UK, this difference was not as pronounced, which I think should give us some food for thought. And then finally, I said, that the Poultry Hub had a later data point during the pandemic, and they actually showed that during the pandemic had kind of a centralizing effect. So in the beginning, they could show that the more centralized network moved to a less centralized network over the course of the first few years of the hub. But then during the pandemic, that kind of concentrated again to the key people in the UK. And I think we're all curious how that would have developed. Maybe our Poultry Hub colleagues have an update for us, which would be curious to hear. A couple of challenges that we found when we implemented this work was first the response rate. As you can imagine, all of our hubs have between, I think, 120 and 150 members. So if you're filling out a survey to track, to show what connections you have across the hub, it's a pretty long survey to fill out. So I think a roughly 50% response rate, which we had across all the hubs, some higher, some lower, is pretty good, but it still only gives us a very partial picture of what those relationships actually look like. The second challenge is the subjective definition of relationships, or what a strong or less strong relationship might look like. We had all different formulations of these questions in our surveys, but ultimately we all try to get at the strength of the relationship. And it's very hard to define that clearly across all the different contexts that we're working in. So it might be that people really had different ideas in mind as they were answering the survey. And then the final one is sort of the implicit assumptions that are embedded within social network analysis. So while maybe we didn't have an ideal network structure in mind, or not every one of us did at least, it is implicit in how the method is applied. And I mean by that, for example, the assumption that a network is stronger when individuals have many ties and are well connected to other members. So this makes intuitive sense, but if we think about it a bit more, especially with the cases that we had here, that in some of our networks, it might actually make more sense to have different clusters of connection. So either around particular geographies or specializations. So if you think about the Tomorrow Cities Hub, for example, that is organized by cities, maybe the ideal network structure would be that everyone based in those cities is extremely well connected, which is not the same network structure as a kind of equitably distributed network across all members where everyone has strong connections. Another example is our hub, for example, we work in Afghanistan on questions of gender and justice. And in those, I mean, you can imagine the security situation there. It might make sense for our partners to reduce their exposure, their connections with external actors, and focus more on other partners in the country. So this might again be another way that an ideal network structure might look different here. And yeah, we conclude that the interpretation of the structure then must follow the intention of the network, which in turn is always situated in a particular context, right? And just the final point I wanted to make on the question of gender that I highlighted before is that there might be a systematic under or overrating in our data that we can't really account for. For example, we could imagine that early career researchers or women might be underrating the strength of relationships with more senior people, etc. So not wanting to be perceived as assuming stronger connections with more senior people if you're a very junior researcher. This is just conjecture at this point, but still, we know that women constantly underrate their knowledge, for example, in responding to surveys. So it might be that they also underrate the strength of connections, and maybe this is one element that could explain some of that gendered effect that we saw in some of the hubs. But I don't know, it's just an interpretation. And then just to conclude and to reflect on a couple of the tensions that Marina outlined. So the first one is the first one on learning and accountability. And I think here, based on all the limitations I've just outlined and when we're implementing this, we should be careful about inferring direct action points from the results of our social network analysis. But instead, we should combine quantitative tools like SNA with qualitative and more participatory methods before inferring causality and making any sort of recommendations for how we should adapt our programming. And then finally, on the internal versus external dimension, and I spoke about this a little bit in the beginning, is the attempt to understand how and why outcomes are emerging. In our case, through relationship building, it's really important to understand what impact we're having at the end. Whilst it might be, enough for funding reporting, etc., to just show what impacts we had, but if we can't show which internal mechanism were helpful or not helpful to getting to that point, the potential for learning is really limited. And I'm glad that when Marina spoke in the beginning about the GCRF evaluation that seems to be ongoing, these building blocks for impact, I think this is precisely one of them, that understanding how relationship building works and then contributes to sort of external impact that these programs are having is really important. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Evelyn. That brings us to the end of the 4 presentations on the paper. And I would like to invite Prasanna Saligram now to provide some reflections. And Prasanna has a bachelor's degree in engineering, an MBA equivalent, and a Master of Science in Global Health and Public Policy. He has a background in engineering, and until February 2018, he was engaged as a research scientist and deputy director at the Health Governance Hub, Public Health Foundation of India in Delhi, undertaking health policy and systems research. Since 2017, he is a guest faculty at the Public Health Division of the Asim Premji University, facilitating the teaching learning of the MA development students on public health related topics. He's currently a program manager with the George Institute for Global Health for the ARISE project, which is one of the GCRF hubs, on urban governance for health and well-being, working with the waste picking community in urban areas. He is also associated with the All India Drug Action Network, advocating for free access to medicine, and was a communications officer with the Global People's Health Movement. His interests include the political economy of health, globalization, trade and health systems governance, and private sector regulation. So Prasanna, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mika. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for this opportunity and for the varied, interesting topics and that the special issue has brought about. Yeah, as Mika said, I have a conflict of interest, so to say. I am part of one of these GCRF hubs of ARISE. So some of the reflections could come also from me being part of the ARISE GCRF hub, and also from the paper on the equitable partnership that we have brought about. So Yeah, I can very much relate to what Marina started with, that initial image. I moved to academia, or have I moved? I don't know. But yeah, I come from the development field. I started with development, and then so some of the tensions that Marina mentioned are very much part of how I uh, groomed myself in some sense. And then also in the initial stages, not even thinking that research can promote development. So in that sense, Marina's tensions are very much a part of my life, so to say. And then, yeah, so can meaningful research be done, and what is impact, and those sorts of things. So I think that's a very valid way to look at the two spheres of research and development. And that brings me to the tensions that Karen mentioned regarding evaluation. So in development field, the most often and the most what you call used method of evaluation was it came because of various histories of how this, evaluations evolved. And so the results based management or the logical framework analysis that came into the development field became the catch all sort of evaluation, which has its um, huge critiques in terms of how it was not every development work can be smart. So in that sense, what Karen was proposing of various ways of theories of change and various ways of looking at evaluation, I think that was a very important aspect, I thought. And another issue with this theory of change is sometimes it can be a tick box, I mean, or a box to be ticked. So in some sense, you are putting up a proposal. So every funder asks for a theory of change. So you put that. And then the fact that she highlighted that some of the hubs did not have a male lead or a male champion, I think that is that was also true for Arise for some time. And then we later on had evolved a mechanism in which we had a dedicated male person. So I think the whole theory of change, because of the history of some of the results-based management and all, could be a little constricting. And also the way, for example, if you are building a community-based participatory research, which is based on inductive ways of doing research, so can you build a theory of change? Can you make it so broad enough that it can capture those elements which are coming from the ground up? I think that is very important. And sometimes the frameworks can be constrictive. And so I think the tensions have to be resolved. And to some extent, credit to GCRF that it did allow for more generic process oriented sort of theory of change rather than the linear sort of theory of change that we get to see normally. So I think that's the way one would look at this. And the resistance to theory of change can also be understood because, again, things are not linear. You cannot say that I put so much money and then I will take so much outputs. I think that's a very reductionist way of looking at things. And then one of the ways in which you look at this is most of the results-based management don't go beyond outputs, and some go till outcomes, but generally impacts are not seen because many things have to converge for the outputs and outcomes to lead to impact. A typical example is a gender thing. So if you are looking at working on gender, one small intervention, one small output might not lead or might not change the larger patriarchal society. So I think that is about my reflections on Karen's presentation. Yeah, Aline's was an interesting one. And I think that also answered some of the tensions of Karen of M&D not taken at the beginning. So this particular one started with an M&D dashboard, the trade hub. And I think the way they went about doing the interaction analysis, because the one way of looking at sustainable development goals is the non-siloed nature of the sustainable development goals. And one of the critiques of Millennium Development Goals was it was too siloed and too vertical. So the sustainable goals in that sense were more horizontal, were more interconnected. It allowed for more interactions. So I think in that sense, doing an interaction analysis to capture the progress towards sustainable development goes beyond the individual silos, I think was a good input. And Genovefa's impact weaving. So one issue with any impact analysis is that it takes a longer time horizon for what you call for impacts to be felt. And given the nature of the projects, for example, the GCRF hubs have been largely 5 years. And yeah, so 5 years is too little a time to look at impacts. In fact, the time paucity is one of the biggest challenges of looking at impacts. What you do today, you might see the result maybe 10, 15 years later. And in that sense, it was heartening to see that Genovefa's paper talking about 10 to 15 years horizon to look at the impacts. Even though I was a little disturbed about the technology trumping the social, I have my reservations of technology leading the change rather than the other way around. So I have a personal reflection of how technology must be subservient to the social processes. And so in that sense, it would be good to know whether technology was preceding the social process or is the other way. I couldn't gather from her presentation. So, and coming to the last one, I can very much relate to what Evelyn presented of about relationships, and it was a little oxymoron in the sense that could we build relationships during COVID? I think that's a major question that we should be asking for someone like for something like Arise Hub. We had upfront put up community-based participatory research as a way, as a method to go forward, but 2 years of the 5 years were wiped out because of COVID and the pandemic. And so could we have built relationships during COVID? I think that's a big, big question for all of us. And then followed by the disruption of COVID was the disruption of the funding. So it was actually after the 5 years, it's been more stop start sort of scenario. And then, so can relationships be really built? I think that's the question. And of course, the larger question of South-South collaboration. By design, GCRF has built into it the North-South collaboration in some sense. So with the UK institutions having to take the lead, so is it possible to have South-South collaboration? Even though I have another experience of NIHR UK project in which it allowed for South-South collaboration, and then that's been a different experience altogether when we have had only Southern partners as part of the larger collaborative project. So one of the issues with pandemic has been that it allows for equitable participation. For example, the junior researchers, the early ECRs could participate as well, because then you are not constrained by the travel, by the budgets, by anything. So they could all participate. But whether the poorly resourced contexts, could they participate with their weak connections? I think that is a larger question that we have to answer. And yeah, I think more or less I was reflecting on all of this, and yeah, I'll stop at this and then we can take further.
Okay, thank you so much for those detailed and interesting reflections on the different presentations. We got about 10 minutes left for some questions. We got a couple of questions from the audience during the presentations. And linking back to the tension, I think there was an interesting comment from Alan Hudson in the chat about a potential expansion or elaboration on tension 2 related to the impact briefing method that Genovefa presented on, in terms of whether there is also a creative tension between understanding the past and shaping the future, especially when it comes to generating perspective theories of change. How does that tension between understanding the past and shaping the future works? I was wondering if Genevieve, you might have some reflections on that.
Yes, thank you. I think for us, what we wanted to achieve was that to understand how different visions of the past, because we have the vision of the researchers first, and we have the vision of the local stakeholders, they can actually shape the future. And I think that the Futures Triangle, it's a nice foresight tool to really support this kind of reflection, because it allows you really to look at present, past and future in the same discussion, and then make them interact to develop different visions of the future. So I think it's really quite a relevant comment, and I think we are deficient in our way that we use past knowledge when we build new theories of change and new interventions, at least in agricultural research. So we tend to start from scratch, let's say, somehow, and so I think it's quite important. I just wanted to take the advantage to really say that the focus, thank you, Prasanna, for your comment, but the focus of the method is really to go beyond the fact that technology drives change. Indeed, it is about understanding that the system works in certain ways and will develop in certain ways, maybe, and that will shape if the technology is used or not. So the focus is really the technology is just one element in the system. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Prasanna, did you want to respond to that?
No, thanks for that. So good. I would be happy with that.
And Marina,
Yeah, systems are important. Yeah.
Marina, I was wondering whether you had any reflections on Ellen's comments around past and future.
Yeah, thanks, Mika. Yeah, that's it. I love Alan's point. I think as I was reflecting on it, I was thinking both about how it relates to the kind of systems change piece, but also I think how it relates to the use of all of this evidence and knowledge that's being generated through evaluation, right? And I think the paper that I mentioned already, which is looking at the whole GCRF evaluation, I think this idea of thinking about building blocks of impact as a way to then shape how we think about programs into the future, right? So finding that kind of space in between understanding what happened, and more importantly, understanding how things worked or how things changed, in order to then think about creating through the work a different future. And in some ways, I think the GCRF kind of experiment, if I can use that language, did sort of shape perhaps what we see as many early career researchers involved will be thinking about and doing in the future. So yeah, I like that. I like that addition. Thanks for the comment.
Great, thank you. Another question that I thought was quite interesting was from Katie Oudendijk, which was a question in response to Karen's presentation, but I think it relates to all of the presentations in a way as well, which is around why the hubs did not have a dedicated MEL practitioner. And I think the broader question is around whether this is a sign that MEL is not prioritized, or whether there is a lack of MEL culture when it comes to research for development. I think, Karen, I would like to invite you first if you have any responses to that.
Yeah, I did give a response in the chat. So I think that there were MEL practitioners involved in all of the hubs, but in some situations, those people were also hub managers or program coordinators, or had other portfolios that had to be managed along with MEL. So I don't think that on the onset of the various programs, I don't think that the amount of work dedicated to the learning aspect of the MEL was really realized. And I think that over time, there was a realization that if we had someone championing this process, it would be really good. So yeah, in my presentation, I was speaking more that there was, because they had a lack of time or a lack of capacity for certain individuals that were taking on that MEL portfolio. But as you know, as the hubs were going through the process and started to understand the funders' requirements, so then it identified the need that perhaps someone that was solely responsible for MEL that could really champion the various MEL activities was something that could be needed. And I think that then changes started to come into play after that. Yeah, Marina, I'm not sure if you also want to give some input on that question.
I'm sure everybody, excuse me, everybody would have something to share on that. But I also know that, for example, Genevieve and Siraj, you guys have had a really long process of intentionally building evaluative and learning cultures in CIRAD. And so the agricultural research for development space, as I said earlier, has this kind of long history, I think, of grappling with some of these tensions, perhaps longer than certainly my experience of this environment in the UK kind of academic context. But yeah, Jenna, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to share in terms of how you've seen that kind of culture and interest in learning and evaluation shift over the years.
Yeah, it's a difficult question because I have contrasted feelings about it, contrasted feelings. I think that in CIRAD we really went on to an intentional effort to build evaluative capacity that is based on evaluation findings at first. So we really focused on what do we learn from the innovation processes that we engage in, and what are the impacts to which research contributes, and how do the other actors actually contribute to this impact. So research is really one small step in the whole innovation process. And then we really focused on building evaluation capacity within the institution and being able to include evaluative thinking into how we design interventions. But it's still, sometimes we come back to one of the comments before about theory of change as a tick box sometimes. So there is this tension about those that really take ownership of these approaches and concepts and way of thinking about impact since the start of the design of the research, and the tension between, okay, I really need to do the impress approach in our case, or the theory of change, whatever, and it's just some sort of show off, I don't know. So it's I'm still a bit mitigated, contrasted about this. But I think that building evaluative capacity, it's quite key, and at least building a common culture of a common language, common syntax, common way of thinking about concepts, that was quite key for us.
Okay, thank you. And Arlene, as someone who was hired specifically as a MEL assistant on one of the hubs, I was wondering if you have any personal reflections on your experience with the MEL culture in such a large R4D program.
Hello. Yeah. Actually, as I was just new to the MEL, also when I entered into the Trade Hub project, so I also learned along with the experts as well. But then for the case of the Trade Hub, we were able to have like a MEL practitioner, but then along the way, there were like problems wherein he has to shift to another work. So we were left behind working for the MEL part of the project. So there was a little bit of the problem that happened. So we had to change the theory of change. It has to be re-evaluated. So that was my experience in terms of working with the monitoring and evaluation and learning component of like a big project like this. So yeah.
Great, thanks for sharing that. I think we're getting to the end of our webinar today. There are a couple more questions, but I invite you to also contact the authors of the different papers individually if you want to learn more about their work. And of course, very much encourage everyone to go and read our special issue, read the papers, hope they are useful to you. And the webinar is recorded, so it's online as well if you want to look back on it. And the presentations of the individual panelists will be shared as well to everyone who was here. And then I would really like to thank Marina, Evelyn, Karen, Genevieve, Arlene, and Prasanna for being here today and sharing your work, sharing your reflections, yeah, and presenting. So thanks everyone for a great webinar, and have a good rest of your day. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Sure.
Bye.